Okay, so this is ridiculous. I'm having so much trouble because I am not technologically adept. And I've just been trying to shoot this video for like 2 days. Updated software, done all kinds of jumping through hoops. And at every step, it seems to be making what I'm trying to do harder. So I'm just going to do this straight up old fashioned way. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read to you something that I've written that I think is really important, really key to everything that's going on, everything that's surrounding the changes in the world and the new direction and the Great Reset and all the things that are happening, which I want to point out to me are, I mean, I don't even necessarily know that what's happening is bad.
Happy or satisfied?
Satisfied.
Why's that?
I have some trouble with happiness. I have a bit of a mood trouble.
If you were to believe everything that is said by the people that are doing what they're doing, they would tell you it's good. And they're like the most professional people in the world. They work for all the biggest corporations and banks and think tanks and NGOs and everything of that nature.
Through 2020, the UN has been leading global engagement to ensure the vision of the future we plan is based on what people around the world want. The Emirates is proud to partner with the UN for this important outreach effort, but the real work of implementing our vision for the future is only beginning now, through youth engagement and by launching a joint report on future possibility.
The United Nations continues to push for a massive rescue package for the world's most vulnerable people and countries, and for a people's vaccine that is affordable and available to all. This is also a moment to strengthen multilateralism and global governance, which are crucial for building a safer, healthier, more sustainable, equitable and peaceful world for all.
Even 2 years ago, when I took the role as CEO of Unilever, when I met with shareholders, there was typically a junior person in the corner of the room with ESG responsibility. Now it is a core question that portfolio managers are asking. We're being constantly asked, are we making progress on our ESG commitments? All of our management's reward is now linked to ESG. And it's because finally the penny is dropping that this is not a trade-off between doing the right thing and doing the profitable thing. Doing the right thing is a pathway to a more profitable, more sustainable business. And you know why? The root cause of it all is that young consumers are voting with their pound, their euro, their dollar, their renminbi, and will only buy from and will only work for private sector businesses that are run properly.
Okay, for the purposes of what I want to do here, which is basically just show the different partners, it does not matter how small my little picture is, which is why I'm setting it up like this. What I want you to focus on is the Great Reset. This is a Google search, the Great Reset Partners, the Great Reset World Economic Forum Partners. And who are the partners on this thing that's happening? World Economic Forum, weforum.org partners. Our partners create long-lasting impact. The World Economic Forum partners are world-class companies with a strong interest in developing systemic solutions to key challenges. They are driving the force behind forum programs. Partners may engage in up to 3 platforms. Access to forum networks and experts provides partners with visibility and time-sensitive insight into strategic decision-making on the issues most important to them. So basically, these are just people that have agreed to push forward the Great Reset. So who are they? I keep talking about these leaders of industry and of our world who are pushing this thing forward. And here they are. Look, here's a list of all the people that are down with the game plan. This is the A section. You see anybody familiar there? Acon, ABB, Amcor. These are all giant corporations. We can filter by industry. They've got all the industries. They've got all the letters. Any single one of these letters, I can go down. Look at this. Under P, there's that many people. Okay, so just think about, like, let's just say MasterCard. MasterCard, that seems like a big one, doesn't it? Okay, MasterCard. There we go. So like this is everybody, and I just wanted to make the video to show the partners and who are they. How did they come up with this plan that's just popped out of nowhere to save the world from the virus? Well, it came from the Davis Manifesto, which is the World Economic Forum again. And to coincide with its 50th anniversary, the World Economic Forum has launched a new Davos Manifesto, a set of ethical principles to guide companies in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Read it from 1973 here. The World Economic Forum is releasing a new Davos Manifesto, which states that companies should pay their fair share of taxes, show zero tolerance for corruption. This whole thing is corrupt. Uphold human rights throughout their global supply chains and advocate for a competitive level playing field. This is neo-communism. That's the guise they're using to put this thing in. Why do we need the Davis Manifesto for a better kind of capitalism? We should seize this moment to ensure that stakeholder capitalism remains the new dominant model. This is all a plan, folks. These are managers of people and resources, and they're supposed to be the most responsible in the world. And I don't believe that those people are involved in like some kind of nefarious conspiracy. I don't believe that. I think that people are just doing what they're doing because they've been trained to do it.
I'm going to provide a little bit of basics around vaccine hesitancy, acceptance and demand. I think it's good that we're all on the same level before we get to the rock stars presentation. The other thing I'm going to say right from the start off is that I really dislike the phrase vaccination hesitancy, because it suggests that the problem is yours. The problem is not mine as the service provider. You are the vaccine hesitant parent. And in fact, it was in Escada 10 years ago or thereabouts, Carl will probably correct me on this, in Berlin, was that 2009, 2010, where I made the same point about hard to reach communities and the fact that we should be using underserved instead of the terms hard to reach, because hard to reach actually suggests the problem is yours, you are hard to reach, and not mine, you are underserved.
So I suppose what we have to do is we have to kind of, I don't want to use the word attack because it sounds aggressive, but I want to say that we have to look at it through that lens. I'm going to try something else here. Okay. Better. Yes, that's better. It should be a little bit better on the sound too. So I've written something and I'm going to read it. I will be referring to just below the camera here. I know I'm giving too much information. It's kind of what I do. Okay, here we go. I want to give you some feelings that I have about everything that's going on because man, me personally, I've lost my job, which means that I have to go out and find a new job. But in a sense, that was what needed to happen anyways. Everything that we're being told, and I'm listening to the people who are telling us how this is going to be moving forward, everything we're being told is that the world is about to change in drastic and fundamental ways.
Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight the severe virus, but to shape the system.
We have a unique but rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to learn lessons and reset ourselves on a more sustainable path. It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. So we must use all the levers we have at our disposal, knowing that each and every one of us has a vital role to play.
Now is the time to think what history would say about this crisis. And now is the time for all of us to define our own role. What is it that would make it so that history would look at this crisis as the great opportunity for reset?
The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. It is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world. Rebalancing investment, harnessing science and technology, and advancing the transition to net zero emissions, all elements of the Great Reset, are fundamental to building the future we need.
The world's problems fit on three sides of a triangle. It's one versus many, man versus nature, and the unfortunate foundation is long-term versus short-term.
We had already income inequality that was fueling income, race, gender inequality. We have a climate emergency, which we can't walk away from. There's no doubt that the very survival of the human race requires us to act.
Any recovery stimulus should have green conditions attached to it. Energy prices should reflect real costs.
You need private sector capital, private sector ingenuity, private sector technology, and private sector capabilities to come to the party. You need enormous trust between the private sector and the public sector for this to actually work.
We have to change our economies dramatically in the next 20 or 30 years, and the next 10 years is absolutely decisive.
The recovery has to be greener than any of the previous recoveries. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that the stimulus package, including fiscal and monetary, are much greener than they were before. So we cannot waste this opportunity to ensure that the very precious money that's raised from the next generation is spent on green and low carbon.
We will now start a quite high number of task forces to look at all the different issues, and we will present all those ideas to the people assembled in Davos. But at the same time, we will make Davos very different, very open, to ensure that we do not fall back to old recipes, but that we really look at forward-oriented solutions.
Young entrepreneurs, especially from developing countries that are there and can see the right problem, can really step up and create solutions.
Finding profitable solutions to problems of the people and the planet, and we're starting to see firms move to that, and we're seeing firms that behave responsibly in that way actually doing better on conventional measures of profitability and doing better in this particular period.
We've also seen social entrepreneurs step in incredible ways. Not only has it exposed the precarious reality, but then it has also exposed the opportunity to recenter the reset around the most vulnerable and those on the edge, where it only takes something like a pandemic or difficult circumstances to slide into poverty.
And then we need to couple that with new initiatives to equip more people with the digital skills they'll need, not just to have a tech job, but a job that is increasingly tech-enabled in almost every part of the economy. If we can empower consumers with all of this, I think we unleash this next generation to have a much broader impact more quickly.
We can never again allow our health, education, care systems to be underfunded.
We need our imagination here. Possible is being redefined each and every day right now. So the next time someone tells us that tackling climate change is either too costly or too difficult, I think we need to remind them and remind ourselves of what just is happening right now.
We not only have to demand change, but also create change.
We have to live up to the expectations which we have created, and we will do so.
And so the question is, can I stop it? No, I can't stop it. How can I stop it? I'm just a crazy guy with a lot of conspiracies and, put whatever labels you want on me. But I have done some substantial reading and listening to a lot of people make a lot of interesting arguments.
And I think it's fair to say that measles is possibly the equity virus, or at least a proxy of shortcomings in our programs and weaknesses in our program delivery. It's a great proxy for highlighting or indicating where we have those programmatic weaknesses. Whilst we all share the same aims, some of us have different opinions as to why this resurgence is taking place in the region. Some people believe that it's about the immunization program limitations and service delivery issues. Others would argue inequities in uptake, and others argue vaccination hesitancy or vaccination confidence, which has been a term that has been used almost synonymously with hesitancy recently, and I'm not sure that's been a positive thing. So when people say to you, vaccination skepticism is old as vaccines themselves, they're incorrect. Vaccination skepticism was there before we started vaccinating. And the French have even recorded it 40, 50 years before Jenner vaccinated Phipps. So the arguments we're seeing today, maybe more interestingly, around vaccine hesitancy and refusal and confidence and trust issues are much the same as they were then. There's not a lot of difference. The way we're communicating around those concerns has changed phenomenally.
I think that I'm a rational person, so I'm going to read you what I think is a rational argument for the way that things are being done. Because it's really the way that things are being done that's the problem for me. I could go more into that, but I've been at a couple of protests and I've spoken to lots of people and I've taken part in a lot of the dialoguing that's going on Facebook. And I'm trying to avoid, in every case, the conspiracy stuff and anything that kind of relates back to pedophilia or sexual deviance.
What we know about Pizzagate so far. Let's begin by going over some background, how it started. John Podesta clicked on a phishing scam email sent to him by hackers and unwittingly handed over his password to them. The hackers then handed over Podesta's emails to WikiLeaks, and they verified their authenticity before releasing them in the run-up to the 2016 US election. Who is John Podesta? John Podesta was Hillary Clinton's head of campaign during this 2016 election. He also worked closely with President Barack Obama and President Bill Clinton during their times in office. His brother, Tony Podesta, who was also involved in this scandal, was recently listed as one of Washington, D.C.'s most powerful people by GQ magazine. And here you see John Podesta with Hillary Clinton, with the Pope, with Bill Clinton, and with Obama. He's clearly someone who has a lot of influence in the political world. What happened next? Volunteers on Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan sifted through emails and uncovered some emails that looked suspicious. First signs of the suspicious activity were emails that appeared to contain some kind of code relating to pizza and other food items. Things blew up when the infamous spirit cooking email from Marina Abramovich to Tony Podesta was uncovered.
Like anything that sounds crazy and is easily dismissible. And I'm not doing that because I'm trying not to sound crazy. I mean, there's a lot of wacky stuff that goes on. Can we just admit that? There's a lot of wacky stuff and people engage in a lot of weird things. And it's not necessarily good for human development or behavior.
There is something going on that's beyond the sort of liberation of fluidity. Something else seems to have happened, where many young people in this country now, there's a percentage increase in the number registering for clinical interventions on transgender questions has increased enormously. There's a certain fashion in schools of some sort, and it's a nerve-wracking business. If you're going to get no platformed in this country at university, you know, Germaine Greer, like, regardless of what one thinks of Germaine Greer, the point is you only have to touch on this question. I don't want to get you to say anything you don't believe, but I'm interested in it because I want to be for liberation. I'm not going to stop anyone dressing how they will. But there's something weird about lots of young women wanting to be young men and lots of young men wanting to be women. I don't feel as though it's a great step forward myself.
For me, you know, a sex change operation opens one door but closes many others. Right? So I personally believe that anyone who collaborates in an intrusion into a developing child's body and mind is guilty of child abuse, a crime against humanity, okay, because that child is not prepared to make such a decision, okay. I think that such decisions about sex reassignment surgery must wait when one attains a majority, which would be, it seems to me, a minimum of age 18. I'm very concerned with this because I think that it's become a fashion, okay, that the transgender definition has become a kind of convenient label for young people who may simply feel alienated, okay, culturally for many other reasons, okay. So that in the 1950s they might have become a beatnik, in the 1960s they might have become a hippie and taken mind-expanding drugs, okay. And so today you're encouraged to think that it's an alienation is because you are not totally identifying with your particular inherited gender definition. So I'm very concerned about this. I think that a lot of it, I think that the collaboration of the bureaucratic machinery with it has to do with the assault on masculinity, okay? Okay, so you see, gender doesn't really exist. It's not really polarity. I mean, everything's all about expanding women's rights, but also terminating men, okay, and defining men out of existence. Masculinity is by definition toxic, okay? Masculinity doesn't exist. And you see, this is the proof of it. Now I began all of my studies, my book Sexual Personae began as a dissertation at Yale graduate school on androgyny. I've always been fascinated, attracted, to the subject of androgyny, and that's what the sexual personae is. I explored it in history, but the more I explored it, I realized that that historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the Greek art, okay, you can see it happening. All of a sudden, okay, there's a kind of the sculptures of handsome nude young men athletes that used to be very robust, okay, in the archaic period suddenly began to seem like wet noodles, okay, toward the end, okay, and that the people who live in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the Mauve decade of Oscar Wilde in the 1890s, whether it's Weimar Germany, people who live at such times, okay, feel that they're very sophisticated, they're very cosmopolitan, okay, and homosexuality, heterosexuality, so what, anything goes, and so on, all right, but from the perspective of historical distance, okay, you can see that it's a culture that no longer believes in itself, okay, and then what you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity, okay, on the edges, whether they're the Vandals and the Huns, okay, or whether they're the barbarians of ISIS, okay, you see them, starting to mass on the outsides of the culture, and that's what we have right now. That there is a tremendous and rather terrifying disconnect between the infatuation with the transgender movement in our own culture and what's going on out there, okay, all right? And so I mean, that's why I'm concerned. I feel it's ominous, okay? I question whether the transgender choice is indeed genuine in every single case. But what concerns me is when well-meaning adults, believe that they're helping people by making it easier some permanent change in the body from which there is no going back. For example, Brown University, one of the elite Ivy League schools in the United States, put sex reassignment surgery on its student insurance program. Okay, so that it becomes they can get a sex change in college. I thought, oh my Lord, okay, I feel that's evil. Okay, because what it does to young people today facing an uncertain job market. Okay, what it says, people who are questioning their gender while they're at Brown University suddenly feel, well, it's like economically, a better judgment, for me to move now on this rather than to wait till I don't have a job and living in my parents' basement. Okay, so actually, the adult community trying to be understanding, okay, is, I think, involved in possibly making a permanent change in someone's life that could have tragic consequences.
It's a distraction. Some of it's real, some of it's not, but it's a distraction, so it doesn't matter. What I want to get to is the people that are actually doing what they're doing right now, the people that are actually taking over the world, like the World Economic Forum and the WHO and all the various public health agencies and all the stakeholders and the stakeholder capitalism and everything that's taking place. And it's all, I mean, this is not a conspiracy theory. What I'm saying, everything I just said just now about stakeholder capitalism and the WEF and the Great Reset, that's all real. That's all
We have all been
real.
affected by disruptions in supply chains, and that means that corporates and businesses, the word resilience is one that requires to always be within the DNA of a corporate, and therefore asset managers need to make sure that there is enough investment in what creates resilience for a corporate. This is not to be belittled or overshadowed in any way. Something else, when we talk about insurers and so forth, how do we make sure that we also have sustainable models for corporates, sustainable models for businesses And putting all of this together, stakeholder capitalism, meaning that the government, the private sector really have to have one language, an identified language that takes risk into account. It's no longer a department within a corporate or a department within a government institution. It really has to be within our psyche.
We have this vaccine hesitancy, if you like, those that sit on the fence, that accept some, delay some, or refuse some vaccines, or vaccination service delivery. And then we have passive acceptance and resilient demand. Passive acceptance, I would argue, is probably the dominant driver of vaccination uptake in most countries. Most people, I would argue, vaccinate because everybody else vaccinates. It's not because we've done a really great job of educating every single last one of our families and every constituents. It's actually a social copying phenomena where we have a supportive healthcare worker community, we have supportive peers, we have supportive community. This is the norm. The majority of people vaccinate. So there's certain mimicking or social copying going on here, which makes our programs actually very vulnerable. Because when we have a crisis, people are unsure around vaccination because they haven't been informed or educated, but have actually vaccinated because everybody else is. And then we're going to talk about resilience, which is where I'm going to take this talk into an area of suggesting we should be focusing on resilience instead of firefighting, which I would argue we're constantly doing. We are constantly firefighting confidence issues, hesitancy issues that for the large part of the last 200 years have remained the same, but we just have a new generation of parents that we're trying to reach.
It's happening. Most people don't see it. Most people don't refer to it. It's happening behind the scenes, and they are re-envisioning the way the world is going to move forward. They've done it through all kinds of initiatives enacted through the UN, specifically through Agenda 21 to lay the groundwork, and then through Agenda 2030 to implement the plan. We went into the implementation of the plan in 2015. This is the acceleration of those plans, and it just kind of coincides with this pandemic.
So the journey to immunization is not very straightforward. It's not that an informed individual is a behaviorally responsive one. I hope we're all on the same page on this. And anybody who's going to have a glass of wine this weekend knows that it's bad for them, but I guarantee it's not going to stop them from having maybe 2 glasses. I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, kind of hoping it does in the questions, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that. So what could be a better return on investment, Rob? What could we invest our resources in if we're not going to tackle hesitancy? If hesitancy is not to blame, how are we going to deal with this in the future? Well, I would argue that now is the time when we need a shift in perspective. Immunization is a best buy. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. And when we talk about universal health coverage, we talk about primary health care, we talk about health security. Without immunization, there's none of that. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments. This is for Africa. I couldn't find data on Europe, but it's likely that the ECDC and WHO may well have this data. But I just picked this up from Africa and found it astonishing, this investment case that has been made from the African continent. The point I'm trying to make is that we really have a very strong and compelling argument to look at how we invest in tackling confidence and acceptance and promote demand for vaccines today. I think we could challenge ourselves to have a mission of building resilience. So when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about the amount of change a system or community can undergo and still retain its essentially the same structure, the degree to which a system or community is capable of self-organization, and then thirdly, the degree to which a system or community expresses capacity for learning and adaptation. Ultimately, if I'm arguing that if a community displays resilience and we can promote resilience in communities, we are less likely when a little ripple of concern comes around our vaccination programs that it doesn't turn into a tidal wave, that actually the community itself is resilient to that murmur.
Now, Am I saying there's no pandemic? No. Am I saying there's no virus? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that viruses exist, respiratory viruses exist. I'm saying that there's a lot of circumspect stuff around the way that governments handled the entire crisis. At the end of the day, all the things that were achieved through their handling of the crisis coincide with goals in Agenda 2030. They just do. But specifically, I want to talk about this one, because this one is really important. And this one, I think you're finding a lot of people at these protests and stuff, that if there's a singular issue that they focus on and that brings them together, it has to do with how we consider what is health, how it should be implemented, and who should be in charge of that, and should vaccines be a part of that. So that's really where I'm going. Vaccines. This is all about vaccines, in my opinion. It is the linchpin. And if the linchpin of all of the things that they want to do has to do with mandating vaccines for people, that has to be a problem. Like, that has to be a problem for some people. I mean, it's a big deal to suggest that vaccinations are going to save everyone from everything, and yet they do. And I'm going to show you how.
Now is the time where we need a shift in perspective. Immunization is a best buy. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice. It's not the government who's saying, okay, just ignore this disease, and you don't get to say ignore what's going on here. There will be the ability, particularly in rich countries, to open up if things are done well over the next few months. But for the world at large, normalcy only returns when we've largely vaccinated the entire global population.
14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice. Normalcy only returns when we've largely vaccinated the entire global population.
Okay, so now with all that preamble out of the way, I'm just going to read this to you, and I think that there's nothing irrational about what I'm saying. So all I ask is that you listen through to the end. It's going to take a while. I wrote quite a bit, so let me get started, because I'm reading off my laptop and the battery might die. There's all kinds of things that are trying to keep me from getting this out, but I'm going to try anyway. Okay, let me start with the opening line, which I think sets the tone for where I'm thinking and how I'm thinking. Today is a good day. It is a good day because it provides us with a unique opportunity to discuss some things that didn't seem nearly as important about our everyday lives until events coalesced and convened together in such a way that it has brought the issue of how our world is to move forward from this place to the fore.
Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system.
And what is this issue I'm referring to? What is that discussion that is now forced on us to be had? In my mind, it revolves around what happens to be the single biggest falsehood and misrepresentation of science repeated in our societies for decades. That lie? Vaccine producers and Big Pharma care about you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of America! President Camacho! Shut up! Sit your monkey ass down. Chill out. Shit. I know shit's bad right now, with all that starving bullshit, and the dust storms, and we running out of French fries and burrito coverings.
Yeah.
But I got a solution.
That's what you said last time, dipshit. I got a solution. You're a dick. South Carolina, what's
up? That's what I thought.
It's sort of an odd position to take, isn't it? It's the opposite of what we see happening in every other way we conceive of power dynamics and systems, in so many headlines that get blazed across the papers and TV chyrons. Systemic racism needs to be addressed. How can we be more inclusive to leave no one behind? There's a big difference between equality and equity. That's a good one. That one's new. I'm ad-libbing here, but I'm sure you've heard that one.
So there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests, oh, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place.
Now, these types of headlines, I believe, tend to come from people who, for better or for worse, mean well.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
These are social justice sentiments. And while we can talk about the merits of looking at everything through the lens of who has the power and who does not, I hope that it's not escaping our media watchdogs and our social justice campaigners that when we take the awesome power of the state and use it to enforce mandated vaccines on the public, that's a pretty obvious abuse of power.
It's not the government who's saying, okay, just ignore this disease and, it's not the government.
Vaccines, no matter how you slice it, are medical interventions that some people, for whatever reason, don't want forced on them.
That's what I thought.
Equality suggests, oh, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place.
According to OpenSecrets.org, the #1 influencer in Washington is the pharmaceutical industry, spending $2.6 billion on lobbying activities from 1998 through 2012. In case you're wondering, that's the #1 position over the same time period, followed by numbers 2, insurance at $1.8 billion, and number 3, oil and gas with $1.4 billion, and defense and aerospace coming in number 4 with a measly $662 million. Not only is it the most influential in the pay-to-play way, it's also one of the most disingenuous industries in the world, because we're talking about the same industry that does vaccines and other products like drugs for other forms of health and mental management that have been shown time and time again to downplay the risks and side effects from their products while extolling the benefits.
So I found a little book at the Library of Congress called The Drug Trust by a man named Morris Beale. And he was a Washington news reporter whose wife had some minor ailment, and she went to the doctors, and she was so mistreated that it made her husband furious. And so he started looking at the medical profession, and he was appalled by what he found out. So he started studying the medical profession, and he wrote a little book about 20 pages long called The Drug Trust. And on the first page of this book, he said that he had found out that every drug manufacturer in the United States was controlled by John D. Rockefeller. Well, I thought that was a very foolish statement. I couldn't believe that. And so I just decided to do a little more research and show that he kind of exaggerated. I wasn't calling him a liar, but I actually didn't think he had his facts right. So as I looked into it, I found out that indeed every drug company in the United States was controlled by the Rockefellers, because it was very obvious on the list of directors of every major drug company in the United States were people from Standard Oil and from Chase Manhattan Bank and from other Rockefeller companies. So it was right there in front of me. There was no arguing about it. John D. Rockefeller.
So the man was right.
The man was actually right. Well, he was a newspaper reporter, and so he knew what he was talking about, but I just simply could not absorb that, because I knew that John D. Rockefeller was the owner of Standard Oil in New Jersey, the greatest monopoly in the world. And in my naivete, I'm a very country boy, I'm very naive, and I thought, if this is the richest man in the world, and he has the greatest corporation in the world, what does he want to fool around the medical profession for? Yeah. Because that wasn't a very highly paid profession in those days, but it was part of the control. And he saw new worlds to conquer, and he took over the entire medical profession in the United States.
Equity.
Has there ever been a more clear and evident case of the rich abusing the rest? This is power dynamics. We know that if you want good health, mental and physical, it is not to be found at the pointy end of a syringe or in a bottle. It is to be found in healthy food, healthy attitudes, healthy play, and yes, meaningful work. And of course, clean air, clean water, and a healthy Mother Earth to sustain all of those things. But Big Pharma doesn't do that for us. They don't do any of that for us. It's not part of their business model. They sell the illusions of health, and sadly, people buy them.
When I was growing up, there were two medicines in the world. You had aspirin and camphofenique. That's all there was. Now there's so many medicines. They got this prescription stuff that they advertise on TV, and I swear, half the time, the side effects are 50 times worse than what the medicine cures. Like, try new Floraflor for itchy, watery eyes. It's Floraflor. Side effects may include nausea, vomiting, water weight gain, lower back pain, receding hairline, eczema, seborrheic psoriasis, itching, chafing clothing, liver spots, blood clots, ringworm, excessive body odor, uneven tire wear, pyorrhea, gonorrhea, diarrhea, halitosis, scoliosis, loss of bladder control, hammer toe, the shanks, low sperm count, warped floors, cluttered drawers, hunchback, heart attack, low resale value on your home, feline leukemia, athlete's foot, head lice, clubfoot, MS, MD, VD, fleas, anxiety, sleeplessness, drowsiness, poor gas mileage, tooth decay, parvo, warts, unibrow, lazy eye, fruit flies, chest pains, clogged drains, hemorrhoids, dry heaving, and sexual dysfunction.
Now, I'm not saying all this to say that there are not useful and practical things that come out of these industries that have not at least had some measurable effect on our lives. They have, of course. But the fact is, we're told over and over again, what they're doing, these wonderful humanitarians of our advanced civilizations, is in some way the greatest thing that society has ever come up with. Fire, the wheels, sliced bread, vaccines. If you listen to the experts like Billy Gates and Fauci and every skeptic out there who has made it their mission to debunk any and all criticism of this wonderful technological miracle that apparently encompasses any and all vaccines, bar none that I'm aware of, but please let me know if I'm missing something, then you're just a foolish conspiracy theorist or a quack.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments today about legal protections for vaccine manufacturers. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, passed by Congress in 1986, established a no-fault system of compensation in such cases. The law set up a special vaccine court to confirm injuries and to award damages accordingly. And again, here is Marcia Coyle of the National Law Journal. Marcia, welcome.
Hi, Jim. Assuming that the language is ambiguous, how do you answer an argument made by the American Academy of Pediatricians who say that if the family wins, vaccine makers are going to be chased from the market, children are going to die, and this isn't what Congress wanted when it enacted the vaccine law?
Well, explain what would the chain be, that there would be so many lawsuits that pharmaceutical companies would just quit making vaccines? It would be too risky for them legally and financially?
Right. Wyeth's counsel, Kathleen Sullivan, said that this type of lawsuit, design defect, was exactly what
design defect.
Right. Defectively designed vaccine.
Okay. In other words, somebody made a mistake when they made the
Yes,
made
exactly.
the vaccine. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
And
Go
that there
ahead.
may be safer alternatives available. But Ms. Sullivan said that this was the exact kind of lawsuit that Congress was worried about back in the 1980s when vaccine makers faced an onslaught of personal injury suits resulting from vaccines. So they enacted this law in order to bar this type of lawsuit.
Yeah.
So Anna Kirkland is the Arthur F. Thurnow Professor, an Associate Professor of Women's Studies and Political Science at the University of Michigan. She holds a PhD and a JD from Berkeley's JSP program, and is the author of 2 books, the brand new and fantastic Vaccine Court, about which she will speak to us today, her 2008 book on fat rights, dilemmas of difference and personhood. She's a co-editor of her 3rd book with her colleague Jonathan Metzl called Against Health, How Health Becomes a New Morality, and a dozen or so other fantastic articles.
So the main questions that I explore in the book, the central question of the book is really, how do we come to know what counts as a vaccine injury? And by we, I mean our whole society, but of course we have institutions that help us to figure this out. So how do we come to know and recognize what counts as real, what gets validated, what gets compensated? And then I ask, why does it matter that we do it in this court? We could do it in different ways through different types of institutions, and we in the United States have decided to do it in the most American of ways by creating a court and paying attorneys to fight it out. And so then what I ask is, how do these controversies and their attempted settlements produce and maintain our immunization social order? And by immunization social order, I mean all of the goods that we secure through having widespread immunization. So the most obvious, of course, is freedom from infectious disease. And this is an absence. We don't notice it, right? Which makes it harder to appreciate. But if you think about it and attempt to quantify it, it is there and we can come to understand it. And I think of it as really robustly politically created. It's created by law. It's created by laws. It's created by social coercion, social control, and it produces disputes. So in this sense, I think of vaccines as thoroughgoingly political. And obviously they are techno-scientific and there are many other things as well. But one thing I wanted to accomplish in the book is just really deeply situating them in law, policy, and social life. What is the vaccine court? How does it settle these controversies and with what evidence? And then I'll close by talking about how exactly the vaccine court produces and maintains our immunization social order. The image you see is the vaccine injury table, which is an administratively created table of officially recognized vaccine injuries. Awards are paid from a trust fund that is funded by a 75-cent excise tax on every dose of vaccine. So as you can imagine, once something like the flu vaccine with 130 million doses, say, distributed, there's a tremendous amount of money available in the trust fund. The way it's supposed to work is that if there's a recognizable, accepted vaccine injury, it goes on the table and compensation is automatic. Now the problem has been that very few claimed injuries are on the table, although a few more have been recently added. The original idea was, oh, we'll just set up this table, we'll put what we know, and everybody will just quickly and easily get compensated. Well, that hasn't really been the way that it's worked out. It's turned out to be much more contentious, with people really fighting over the causation and really fighting over what the evidence shows and whether we have good enough evidence. So now I'll talk to you about just a couple of instances where I'll try to give you a more vivid picture of what the evidence sometimes looks like and how people are disputing about it. So there are these explicit hierarchies of evidence, and these come through from the court itself, from the Institute of Medicine. All kinds of expert bodies have articulated, okay, this is really good evidence, this is slightly less good, this is, not kind of okay, but we really don't want to rely on it. And this, at the top of the slide, you'll see what the mainstream hierarchy of evidence looks like. So, for example, like the treating physician testimony. This is really interesting. How much weight should go to that? So this is the physician who's treated the person, right? They can talk about that person and what they think is going on with them. And in some cases, the vaccine judges have said, look, that's very important evidence, right? That's a medical expert who's looking at this person. On the other hand, a treating physician maybe doesn't know anything about epidemiology or what the latest surveillance epidemiology shows, right? So they have one particular kind of expertise, but are they more like the mother, for example, who says, well, he was never the same, his behavior changed in this way, I know it's related. How different is the physician from the epidemiologist, and what is their different value in saying what the evidence shows? Now, of course, mobilized activists see the evidence very differently. And so by activists, I mean vaccine critical activists, folks who are opposed to most of what the vaccine court is doing because it's not compensating for things that they think it should be compensating for. And they have their own evidence, right? And often a considerable amount of it coming from a lot of different sources. So here, some of their favorite sources are past compensated cases, right? If you got compensation before, doesn't that mean that that's a vaccine injury, right? Does the compensation validate that an injury occurred? Seems like it might, except that I just told you about the negotiated settlements and, and the way the evidence has shifted. And so there's quite a lot of disagreement about what that means. There's a great deal of parental observation, right? And it's quite interesting to think about in what ways parents are experts and about what precisely, what kinds of knowledge do they have, how does that differ from other kinds of knowledge? They also bring in vaccine package inserts, which is, the pharmaceutical companies are required to put every possible adverse events from clinical trials in the package insert. So you can find all kinds of scary things in there. They're not causally validated, but it's a frequent, like, hey, this is written on this package insert, and it sounds really scary. And look, the pharmaceutical company themselves wrote this. So that is compelling in some cases. But the favorite parallel database is this Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, rhymes with bears. And this is a public database. Anyone can report to it, where you report a vaccine injury that has happened. So it's literally vaers.gov. You can look it up. It's right there. It's online. It's a passive surveillance system, meaning it's like a trap just for things to come to it, right? It doesn't judge anything. Manufacturers are required to report to it any adverse event that comes out of any of their clinical trials. Doctors and health professionals are required to report it if they think a patient has experienced a vaccine reaction. Attorneys report to it. There was an interesting thing with when the autism cases were coming up, lots of VAERS reports were being filed for autism, which were then traced back to the attorneys, because then they can file the cases, and then they can say, look at all those VAERS reports, right? You can produce it and then jump out at the other side and point back to it, right? It has that nice feature because it's open. It's an open passive surveillance system, which is what you have to detect signals, right? Remember, they're looking for the signals, and it does work. There have been validated vaccine injuries that have been first detected through an uptick in VAERS reports, where, hey, that looks a little weird, that many infants should not be suddenly clustering with those cases. Let's have a look at that in the vaccine safety data link, where we can perform actual statistical operations to see if there really is a causal link. And critically, the fourth thing is that the vaccine court diffuses dissent. It has drawn people into it. It has caused them to make arguments in certain kinds of ways. People who have been compensated are generally pretty happy with that. It has kept those folks from being part of social movements, and perhaps quite sympathetic ones, because they would have much better cases than the folks who are left uncompensated. So it diffuses dissent in ways that we know the courts do by bringing in social movement actors and drawing their attention into making legal arguments, presenting evidence, and making those kind of arguments, as opposed to doing something else that could be more burdensome to absorb for the immunization social order.
Even with the missteps of previous eugenic and sterilization campaigns in the rear view, something that is rarely discussed but happened, the very thought that perhaps the science of vaccination could or would be used by actors who had less than messianic convictions for their products is anathema to public discourse in recent years. So, that's not a very good flowing statement, but what I'm trying to say is, you can't talk about it because obviously it's good. And if you suggest that it's not good, there must be something wrong with you. You can't talk about it.
And that's the question I think we really have to ask ourselves. Why do so many Americans no longer trust our regulatory officials and trust this process? And one of the reasons is, vaccines are a very, very interesting and very different kind of medical prerogative, because it's a remedy that it's a medical intervention that is being given to perfectly healthy people to prevent somebody else from getting sick. And it's the only medicine that is given to healthy people. So you would want, and particularly to children who have a whole lifetime in front of them, so you would expect that we would want that particular intervention to have particularly rigorous guarantees that it's safe. Because you're saying to somebody, we are going to make you make this sacrifice for the greater good. You have no health problems. You have zero risk of this disease. Yet we are going to force you to undergo a medical intervention. And our side of the bargain should be, we want this to be completely safe. In fact, what we know about vaccines, and this is from HHS's own studies, a 2010 study by the Agency for Healthcare Research that was commissioned to look at vaccine injury, because CDC for many years had been saying vaccine injury only occurs 1 in a million. But what AHRQ found, which is a federal agency, they looked at one HMO, which was the Harvard Pilgrim HMO, and they did a machine cluster analysis, in other words, artificial intelligence counting, a very, very accurate counting system. And they said the actual rate of vaccine injury is 2.6%. That means 1 in 40 people get seriously injured by vaccines. And do we have a right to say we are going to impose this intervention on people where there's a 1 in 40 chance that you may get injured in order to protect hypothetical people catching that particular disease? And for anybody, and this I think is something that Alan really has to, I think, Alan, that you need to come to terms with in terms of crafting your own arguments about this. It's not hypothetical that vaccines cause injury and that injuries are not rare. The vaccine courts have paid out $4 billion, and the threshold for getting back into a vaccine court and getting a judgment, HHS admits that fewer than 1% of people who are injured ever even get to court. The other thing is, vaccines are zero liability. So this is an industry that went to Congress in 1996, and they had a diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine at that time that was called causing brain injury in 1 out of every 300 people. And they said to Congress, we cannot make vaccines safely. They are unavoidably unsafe. That is the phrase in the statute, unavoidably unsafe. The only reason that we're going to continue to make vaccines is if you give us complete blanket immunity from liability. And Congress gave it to them. So today you have a product that if it injured you, no matter how negligent the company was, no matter how sloppy their line protocols, no matter how toxic the ingredients they choose to use, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company. And that company, therefore, has no incentive to make that product safe. And that should be troubling to any of us who are part of the legal system that is saying we are going to force people to take this intervention.
It has been banned from discussion and removed from rational discourse by responsible news programs because it turns out when people would come onto programs where the discussion took place between an advocate of vaccination and someone who was presenting the counter-argument, shockingly, the latter would always come off as looking for rationality and asking good, well-formulated questions and ask, inevitably, for nothing more than either additional or improved study, or the thing that it was decided could never be tolerated. A study of health outcomes of the health outcomes of vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. Well, please, the argument would always come from the big pharma rep. We already know that vaccines have saved countless lives, and if you wanted to do that study, there would be a cascade of people dying all over the world as a consequence. Children dying 1 in 1,000 from measles. More children still subjected to the iron lungs from the earlier days of the polio scares that kickstarted the massive influence of the industry itself.
How do you answer an argument made by the American Academy of Pediatricians who say that if the family wins, vaccine makers are going to be chased from the market, children are going to die?
So as I looked into it, I found out that indeed every drug company in the United States was controlled by the Rockefellers.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, kind of hoping it does in the questions, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that.
Equity.
So we can't do that. And in fact, it would become tiresome and so much wasted effort in dealing with these crazy people who want to cause harm and death to countless innocents. talking points always and inevitably end sort of like this. Well, that person is just a crazy kook denier of science and should be dismissed as such. We do not give these people a platform. They're just confusing the general public with all their questions and concerns. We know the history of vaccines. They're safe and effective and have saved countless lives. In fact, it's a foregone conclusion that this is undeniably true. So why should we even have that conversation? What we should do is make them mandatory so that we can be done with this charade of a conversation with foolish people who will only cause great harm to others.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, kind of hoping it does in the questions, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that.
Equity.
But this one is my favorite. As per the Supreme Court ruling in 2016, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. They said that.
They are unavoidably unsafe. That is the phrase in the statute. Unavoidably unsafe.
I don't know about how you view this type of thinking, but I've seen it played out countless times, and every time the answer is to dismiss the possibility of dissent and promote authoritarian values. And so I ask you, is this not a social justice issue? Is this not the big bad corporate world telling the little people that they must do as they're told, even though it may cause harm? How many people are familiar with the Vaccine Injury Court? How many people know that it has paid out over $3 billion in damages since its inception in 1986? And trust me, they don't like to frivolously give away money. Every single dollar of that $3 billion could be in no way paid out for any other reason than clear and undeniable proof that damage was caused by a vaccine or a battery of vaccines that they tell us are unavoidably unsafe.
For the immunization social order.
Equity.
Have you ever wondered how it became this way? I'm sure it's in no small part due to huge amounts of money, influence, power, stated goals of eradication, and campaigns of information aimed at parents and medical practitioners, government, health agencies, and every conceivable organization out there whose goal is to promote the cohesion.
My hope is that between the pandemic shock, the climate change threats, and the most recent geopolitical changes taking place around the world, multilateralism will come back in a transformed and hopefully enhanced way, because we have to deal with some of these issues on a multilateral basis. There's no point trying to kill a pandemic at home. There's no point trying to stop climate change in the domestic market. Those issues, as you very well know, and as the WEF has constantly advocated, are global issues that need to be dealt with on a cooperative manner. And I hope that the business and the private sector can actually head in that direction, set standards, move forward, and that geopolitical games will come along and will put public interest and common goods at the center of policies going forward.
Not only on the local level at your doctor's offices and local clinics, but also to promote that cohesion on the planetary scale at the behest of business and society. If you're paying attention, you may have noticed that I put the order of needs in that phrase with business first, because the truth is, so do they. The story of how the vaccination industry became so powerful is a long and interesting history. And if you'll spend some time looking into it on your own, I guarantee you'll find the same voices again and again crying out to keep you from doing anything other than listening to them and deferring to their expertise. There's no question that vaccination is the finest medical achievement of the modern world, they will say. In fact, we don't even have to think about it, and soon enough, according to the plan and the agenda, you and I won't be given the option to make those choices for ourselves. If nothing else, COVID-19 has provided both big pharma and our public health agencies, who not only buy but sell and actively promote for their own selfish reasons the kinds of sentiments I'm describing, with the situation they have recently been calling for and working towards for decades: mandatory vaccinations. Oh no, they'll say, it won't be mandatory, but you just won't be able to have your lives back without it. No job will be allowed without it. No universal basic income will be provided without compliance to it. No travel outside of the home, and maybe even no home will be afforded to those silly people who think they can go from go on in the post-COVID-19 world that is currently being set up in the background thanks to our friends at the World Economic Forum and their now totally necessary and inevitable push to the Great Reset they have been planning for years. After they themselves, with the help of their friends in the global community, planned for this inevitability and are now seizing the reins of control over our lives. But don't concern yourself with it. It was inevitable, given all the things they tell you about the dangers of displaced people that was heading our way after the Fourth Industrial Revolution could hit the tipping point if we were not prepared, and could have created a potentially chaotic existence. My, how lucky we are that they were looking out for us.
Imagine the workers who are potentially exposed at work, especially in the case of care, but in all of those sectors, often working 2 to 3 jobs because not one alone is not enough. So bringing the virus from place to place. Often no sick pay, which is a fundamental public health question that needs to be addressed going forward. We have to recognize we can't expect people to quarantine and isolate if they are not able to live on their salary and if they won't have some financial replacement. And multi-generational households and this question of where you live. So all this combines to create a very severe mental health and physical health, high COVID rates situation. And I think some of these things are fixable, and I know they're all fixable, but it does have to deal with addressing the precarious status of these workers.
There was a lot of concern that COVID would halt momentum on ESG and on the rise of the green economy. But counter to that, what we're seeing is that COVID may actually be accelerating the integration of climate risk into investment strategies. And in fact, our view is that the recovery will likely increase demand for sustainable and climate resilient investments.
As a point of interest, you could make the argument that these people are looking out for people in the world. But by looking out for people means that you're going to control every aspect of their lives. And you're going to put them in this blockchain where they can never really crawl out of it unless they absolutely agree with the orthodoxy of the entire system from the top down. There's some questionable motivations there. It's a little questionable. Okay. Yeah. So, it was inevitable, given all the things they tell you about the dangers of displaced people that was heading our way after the Fourth Industrial Revolution could hit the tipping point, and if we were not prepared, could have created a potentially chaotic existence. They're looking out for us. You little free humans can be such a burden on their world and just a little too unpredictable, especially if you were all being displaced by technology and sitting at home on the public dole, now free with the time to sit and think.
I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all chains still binding me. Yeah. Wish I could say all the things that I can say when I'm relaxed. I'd be starting anew. I wish I could be like a bird in the sky. Don't leave me. How sweet it would be to find that I could fly. I'd soar to the sun and look down at the sea. Then I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels to be free. And then I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels to be free. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Wish I could break all the things that bind us apart. Wish you could know what it means to be me. And you'd see, you'd agree, everybody should be free, 'cause if we ain't, we're murderous. Wish I could be like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be that I could fly, soar to the sun, look down and see, then I know, yes I know. Oh yeah, spirit's moving now. I know, got news for you, I already know. Jonathan Livingston Seagull ain't got nothing on me.
Just imagine how difficult those people would be if they kept demanding rights instead of protection. Yes, now that we're all really scared into compliance, it's the right time to make it permanent with the biggest, baddest surveillance state ever conceived. Get those 5G towers up before the people start figuring out what's going on. Am I right? As a side note, when everything transfers from the former material world where we could all interact with one another, free from the influence of the sensors, do you really think it's going to be long before the new digital future we're entering into won't be scrubbed of alternative viewpoints for your own protection from bad actors who keep encouraging you to absorb more information and to think for yourself? Imagine what hubris to suggest that people could think for themselves. But should you? Again, I suggest you look into it. I'm not getting paid for my suggestions, and I don't wish to impose my will on anyone, so I'm already in the opposite camp from the people who wish to tell you how your life is going to be from now on. I suppose I'm just doing it because I'm a denier, whatever that means. So being the bad actor that I apparently must be, according to our public health experts, I would suggest you go to BitChute or BrandNewTube or one of the many other platforms popping up around the interwebs as alternatives to YouTube, because Google has just been so busy protecting you from the bad ideas that might go against the authoritarian impulses of their safe censorship policies that have only come around in earnest in the last few months, because now the danger of not listening to our social controllers has become a real threat to our very existence.
Do you know, Lauren, why QAnon types seem to focus so much on pedophilia rings and human trafficking? This seems to be their thing.
Well, I think there's two things going on. So from the perspective of Q and those who are politically aligned with this source and promoting the conspiracy, they are just taking advantage of this to promote their political agenda, to gain support. Why it works is because in conspiracy theories in general, people are very interested in getting involved in a group that they think is involved in some kind of salvific function. They're going to save the world. They're a small group of people who have special knowledge and insight, and they're going to overcome a sort of great ignorance in the world, and they're going to rescue, particularly, the appeal is that they're going to rescue the innocent. They're going to rescue those who are being abused. So a large number of conspiracy theories or political propaganda in general usually uses motifs about women and children being raped, tortured, sexually molested, exploited, killed, etc., in order to galvanize this desire to come to the rescue of these people on the part of the audience.
Children are going to die.
Equity.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that.
There's no point trying to kill a pandemic at home. There's no point trying to stop climate change in the domestic market. Those issues, as you very well know, and as the WEF has constantly advocated, are global issues that need to be dealt with on a cooperative manner.
14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization.
Now there's so many medicines. They got this prescription stuff that they advertise on TV, and I swear half the time the side effects are 50 times worse than what the medicine cures.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
For the immunization social order.
Equity.
See how that works? But if I can leave you with 3 names that should be in your typical DuckDuckGo searches, may I suggest Del Bigtree and his program The Highwire. Check out Robert Kennedy Jr. and his amazing site Children's Health Defense, and look up Suzanne Humphreys and read her excellent book Dissolving Illusions. In fact, there are many more people out there who are summarily attacked and dismissed with countless hit pieces from the usual suspects whenever they simply can't stand keeping their mouths shut anymore in the face of this medical tyranny. They run the spectrum from New Age gurus to reform pharmaceutical representatives to people like Dr. William Thompson of the CDC, who had his story told by the documentary Vaxxed, which was in turn promptly dismissed as pseudoscience. The way this is done time after time is the tried and true method of damage control by PR agencies, individual actors at the behest of big pharma cash-in prizes, and true believers, often the so-called skeptic community out there, self-appointed hall monitors for the status quo, whose only real moral failing is that they seem to wish to be accepted into the crowd that has all the money and influence. I'm not questioning their motivations either, but I wonder if they see just who and what it is they're defending these days.
14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. And when we talk about universal health coverage, we talk about primary health care, we talk about health security. Without immunization, there's none of that. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments.
Perhaps defenders of the vaccination orthodoxy work in a lab or a hospital or a pharmaceutical company, and they went through the same indoctrination that most people go through on a casual basis thanks to their local news affiliates. But theirs is much more intense, and in a lot of cases, I think it's safe to say it forms their egos. But I don't hold them in contempt. That's how tobacco science worked after all. They fostered doubt and what-if mirages, reinforcing it with propaganda that profits paid for. I'm sure it hasn't gotten any better in the decades since it was first used as a practice. What a laughable concept that the biggest industries in the world would get better at promoting their bottom lines. That said, I would like to point out here what I have always considered to be an interesting phenomenon between the two warring factions, if it makes it easier to envision the presumed sides. I hear often from people who used to be pro-vaccine until one of 2 things happened. Either they would have a child that became vaccine damaged, and it forced them to turn to the alternative community that was actually trying to support them in their efforts to rehabilitate their child, and they would do so without judgment. In fact, they would help fight for recognition from a bureaucratic guard agency that has been set up to protect manufacturers from liabilities, literally giving them immunity in the United States, where most of these larger companies came from. The other reason people would turn against the vaccination orthodoxy would be doctors, nurses, clinicians, naturopaths, holistic medicine practitioners, and other alternative health providers would be so foolish as to start reading the very rarely reported facts and studies that show negative associations with increasing vaccination schedules. The ones who may have been formerly regarded as cutting-edge leaders in the world or in their field, only to be labeled as quacks once they deviated from the vaccination cult.
The proposition in the theology that smallpox and polio were abolished due to vaccination is controversial. That is not a proposition that is universally accepted. And if you notice, all the infectious diseases, whether it was scurvy or tuberculosis, for which there were no vaccines, along with peripheral fever and diphtheria and pertussis and measles, all disappeared at the same time without vaccination. Now, CDC actually examined that because it became such a part of the orthodoxy of vaccines that the idea that smallpox and polio were abolished because of vaccines and these other diseases. They did, John Hopkins and CDC in 2000 did a comprehensive study of that proposition. The study was published in Pediatrics, which is the journal for the American Association of Pediatrics, which is kind of a redoubt, a fortification for vaccine orthodoxy. So it's a publication very, very friendly and supportive of vaccination. For people who want to look up the study, the lead author is Guyer, Guier. And the conclusion of that study is that the abolishment of mortalities from infectious diseases that took place during the first half of the 20th century had virtually nothing to do with vaccines. It had everything to do with sanitation, with nutrition, with hygiene, with electric refrigerators, with reduction in population densities, and essentially engineering solution, clean water, good food. And that was, and actually there was a guy called Edward Cass, who was the head of Harvard Medical School at that time, who gave a very, very famous speech in which he warned that people who were promoting vaccines and other technologies would try to take credit for those reductions in mortalities from infectious disease. And he said, beware of them, because they'll try to monitor that, they'll try to monetize them and use that to increase their power and their prestige. So it's something that you might look at. Again, it's called Guyer, Guier.
And then we have the opposite to those loons. The ones who believe in science. The ones who make tremendous amounts of money by denying there can be any risk. And always point the finger anywhere but themselves. Well, that's not the psychopathic profile of a giant corporation, now is it?
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments.
Here's an interesting excerpt from an article entitled, Are Corporations Psychopaths? Psychopaths are typically intelligent, personable, and disinhibited, and have an alluring aura of confidence.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
Yet they also lack feelings of empathy, guilt, and remorse. That seemingly minor emotional quirk has had a dramatic effect on the way they behave, often leading to antisocial behavior. However, psychopaths are not incapable of moral reasoning. Multiple studies have found that they are particularly adept at certain types of moral thinking, particularly those that balance the consequences of actions. So where non-psychopaths might experience revulsion at the intentionality of killing one person to save the lives of several others, psychopaths are far more likely to dispassionately favor the needs of the many over the needs of the few.
Take a look at America today. Over 150,000 Americans are dead from COVID-19. We have a health crisis worsened by Trump's failure to act, an economic crisis deepened by Trump's failure to get the virus under control, a racial justice crisis fanned by Trump's words of hate, a climate crisis exacerbated by Trump's denial of science, and America needs a plan to solve all of them. So by the end of my first term, we are going to be on an irreversible course to achieve net zero emissions, economy-wide, no later than 2050. Times are tough now in America, but we've been here before. We can do this. We can build back better. And I'm looking forward to getting started as soon as we can.
They make good utilitarians. But now, take the influence of money and combine it with the awesome power of government. Check out the documentary 1986, The Act, for more on that. I should warn you though, it's been produced by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and as we all know, he's a quack, am I right? Imagine, you destroy a highly capable and respected young doctor's career by fabricating a story around the actual events that took place after a press conference he gave suggested they found an issue in the gut bacteria of children who were vaccine injured. Go ahead and look up whether or not there's been any recent research into gut microbiome in autism. But that's a good snapshot of the loons and quacks and science deniers we find playing Davy against the pro-vaccine Goliath. And they, of course, have their front men and women who advocate for the continuance and additions to the vaccination schedule that has gone, according to Children's Health Defense, from the 1986 level of 12 shots and 25 antigens for 8 diseases to the new and improved 54 shots and 70 antigens for 16 diseases in 2019. Well, obviously kids are healthier these days, right? I mean, I know that's not a scientific statement or anything, and it's also not scientific to say that autism prevalence has gone from, according to the CDC's own website, 1 in 150 on the spectrum in the year 2000 to 1 in 54 in 2008. Keep in mind that was 12 years ago, and I bet the trend has reversed course.
I agree with you. There was tremendous faith in vaccination during that period. When you grew up, I grew up, Alan, we had 3 vaccines, and all of them were deemed as necessary. There were fewer diseases. Today's kids have to take 72 vaccines, 72 doses of 16 vaccines in order to stay in school. And that explosion of new vaccination came in 1989, right after the passage of VICA, Vaccine Act. The Vaccine Act gave blanket immunity from liability to vaccine companies. And so those companies all of a sudden looked around and they said, holy cow, now we've got a product where we are completely excused from the highest cost from that afflicts every other medical product, which is the downstream liability for injuries. That's the biggest cost for every medicine. Not only that, vaccines have another exemption that most people don't know about. They are the only medical product that does not have to be safety tested against a placebo. And that exemption is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was a quasi-military agency, which is why people at the CDC have military ranks like Surgeon General and they wear uniforms. The vaccine program was conceived as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country, and they wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with a biological agent, anthrax or something like that, that we could quickly formulate a vaccine and deploy it to 200 million American civilians without regulatory impediments. They said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to test it. And that takes 5 years to do double-blind placebo testing. So let's call it something else. We'll call it a biologic, and we'll exempt biologics from safety testing. So not a single one of the vaccines, the 72 vaccines now administered to our children, have ever been tested against a placebo. And I, in fact, sued HHS in 2016 and said, show me any placebo studies that you have for any vaccines. And they were unable to do so. None of them have been tested. And you don't have to sue them like I did. Anybody can go on their cell phone and look up manufacturer's insert, hepatitis B vaccine, Gardasil vaccine, polio vaccine. Do you know how many days the current polio vaccine, do you know how many days it was safety tested for, Alan? 48 hours. Sure. The hepatitis B vaccine, the Glaxo version, was 4 days. The Merck version, 5 days. That means that if the baby they gave that to had a seizure on day 6, it never happened. If the baby died on day 6, it never happened. If the baby got food allergies that were diagnosed 2 years later, it never happened. If the baby got autism, which is not diagnosed till 4 years of age, 4.2 years of age, it never happened. Autoimmune diseases, you cannot see those if you have these short-term studies, and you can't see any risk if you don't test against a placebo. And my question is, nobody knows because of that, nobody knows the risk profile for any vaccine that is currently on the schedule. And that means nobody can say with any scientific certainty that that vaccine is averting more injuries and deaths than it's causing. And my question is, how in the heck can we be mandating to children that they take a medical product for which we do not know the risks? And to me, that is criminal.
We know that there's a strong economic return on investments.
So why can't we have clear and open discussions about this stuff? I mean, surely it must be considered something of importance to think about.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
Equity.
We can talk forever about the problems that society has had to deal with of systemic racism and inequality. Both of those things, of course, can only be solved if we give enough power to government agencies that will work hand in hand with the giant corporations to save us from the bad people we used to be, before we let them tell us about it endlessly, until finally we are all giving in and saying, do whatever you want, just please stop telling me how bad I am so I can get on with my life. The incurable and irreconcilable problem seems to be this. Details lend themselves to too much speculation and splitting of hairs for people whose job it is to literally foster and promote their own versions of reality, and the ones upon which we have been told modern medicine and healthcare has been built around, thus making it easy to attack people from outside the status quo. Any challenge to the industry, then, has become a threat to all people. Freedom itself is the threat to the new biosecurity world state.
I've always accepted that, powerful, rich people had been planning for something like this, and when it happened, they would be ready, and it looks like they were.
Yeah.
What I reject is the idea that Prince Charles and Bill Gates and other powerful tycoons, your man Schwab, all sat around in darkened rooms planning the crisis. I mean, the worst of the conspiracy theories is that COVID was planted in order to engender the crisis. I reject that, but I do think it's fairly logical that clever, rich tycoons and powerful people were planning for something like this, and now they're ready and they're poised, and it's already to our disadvantage because they've turned all our towns into impossible places for cars.
Yes, they don't sit around in darkened rooms because they are doing it at Davos, which is a meeting place of it's sometimes described as a place where billionaires go to lecture millionaires on how ordinary people live or how they should live. And this is what happens, that they fly in their private jets and they travel from the airport in their limos to these glorious hotels, none of which I'm sure have darkened rooms. And they get off on delivering these speeches where they've used code phrases like build back better, and they get reported enthusiastically in a lot of the media, and the media goes, oh, that sustainability sounds really great. It sounds like really eco-friendly. It'll save the planet. So you see how it works. It's not kind of cackling baddies sitting around in darkened, smoke-filled rooms. Well, they wouldn't smoke out, obviously, anymore. In darkened rooms, plotting the destruction of civilization. It's all out in the open. And our mistake is to go, well, they can't be serious because it all sounds a bit kind of crazy. That's their secret weapon, is our complacency and our kind of, oh, it's never going to happen. And it's going to be universal basic income, which is another of the great resets, great schemes for us all. Sure. It's going to be terrifying.
There's something crazy going on. I can't get a handle on it. And your feelings?
Why aren't more people resisting? I mean, actually, I can almost answer that question. There was a demo in London last night, and the police, some of whom speak with accents which suggest they've been imported from other countries, maybe from countries where police are more used to being boot boys. The police are clamping down on any demonstrations very, very aggressively. I hear reports that they were targeting women specifically in order, I suppose, to sort of pique the gallantry of men among the demonstrators, and perhaps generate more violence that the police could then crush aggressively. Now you compare and contrast the kid glove treatment of the Extinction Rebellion protest, which closed down London,
and Black Lives Matter,
far more damage. and Black Lives Matter cause far more damage to property. This government is very, very serious about forcing its lockdown agenda, whether we like it or not. What the government's propagandists have done is created a wedge between those of us who believe in principles like liberty and proportionality, and the cowed section of the populace, which has actually started blaming people like me, people who are trying to stick up for our freedoms, and they're saying, well, if you'd worn a mask earlier and if you'd obeyed the lockdown more religiously, this wouldn't have happened. It's really scary.
And it's such rubbish. I mean, you know, as a lot of people have been tweeted. So those face masks worked really well, didn't they? Got another lockdown. That first lockdown really worked well. Let's have another one. If the first one had worked, why would we need a second one? Why have we still got to wear face masks when it's clearly not working? I mean, there is something mad going on, and you're right, James. I urge all the listeners to at least be skeptical about what this government's up to, and we have to try to resist the stringent changes they're trying to make to what once were our free lives.
The amount of money and influence it took to build this reality is mind-blowing, and it has no counterpart or adversary that can mount an offensive strategy as centralized and monotheistic as it does. To quote a scene that sums it up nicely, "Oh, I'm afraid the Director Shield will be quite operational when your friends arrive." Star Wars reference. The point being is that, it's you thought maybe you had something going on, but we got it all. We anticipated you. We planned for all of this. The Death Star is real, and it's about to blow some shit up.
And this is not just a money versus life argument, which some people have put it into. This is a life versus life argument, because we already know the other problem is that a lot of people didn't attend hospital with heart attacks. They estimate from the Office of National Statistics was 6,000 to 12,000 excess deaths from cardiovascular disease over this period. And the Office of National Statistics have also calculated that the impact on the economy is likely to cause 17,500 excess deaths every year for the next 5 years, which is, these are their figures, these are not my figures. This is 80,000 deaths, which is far more death than we've already had from COVID. So it's not one versus the other. It just isn't. But even if it is just one versus the other, it's still just very difficult to justify doing it. So I thought, well, someone's got to try and say this, even though I knew I'd be viciously attacked, and I was, but I put it out there. And I think the argument's even more valid now than it was at the time.
Yeah, and Malcolm, I saw it at the time, and I pumped it out there as much as possible and clarified the same points, that there is a price for what you will pay to extend a life year. Otherwise, the whole world would collapse. Of course there is. Otherwise, you could spend, I don't know, $1 billion on a program to save someone with a rare disease or get them an extra year of life. You could spend $1 billion, but then you'd kill an enormous amount of people by using that $1 billion. So it's obvious, but I agree, not too many. And the thing about the numbers is, and I like to say this in simple terms, Imperial College said 500,000 approximately. We know for an actual fact that they were out by a factor of 10 or more. So the 50,000 who did pass are who was going to pass anyway. And the lockdown came after the curve had turned. Professor Carl Hennigan flagged that in April. And we know from 22 published analyses that there's essentially no correlation between lockdown stringency, and mortality per million. So, and Peru had the military lockdown with mandatory masks. And months later, the inevitable happened anyway, seasonally, regionally, and they're the worst in the world, etc., etc. So we actually know, insofar as you can know anything in science, nothing is 100% proven. We know lockdown made almost no impact to mortality. That's a fact. We know that England had, say, 50k. That was always going to be approximately the case. So they really saved no lives. So it's all cost with no real benefit. So theoretically, it's almost infinite, the cost per quality saved.
As you say, when you look at lockdown and you look at the countries that locked down the tightest and the countries that didn't lock down, you can't see any positive impact from lockdown whatsoever. I mean, this was an experiment. normally if you're going to do in science, if you're going to do something, you first of all say, let's see if it might work. So you'd get two groups, you'd lock down one, you wouldn't lock down the other, you'd wait some time. I mean, this is an experiment that's almost impossible to do just because the logistics are gigantic. But then you just say, right, this has never been done before, ever, that we lock down healthy people. And now we're going to do it.
It is the most insane period in my lifetime, and I'm 30 years in technical leadership, and almost everything I've seen being done is unscientific. It's actually profoundly unscientific, and yet it keeps happening.
The Church of Modern Medical Science is a predator introduced into the world that has no natural enemy that can properly mount a worthy defense against its various tentacles and talons. It doesn't just control what gets accepted as mainstream science. It controls the very agencies and players whose job it is to regulate its own environment. Those organizations have long since become captive to the industry that has dominated them. It's called regulatory capture, and it happens when government watchdog regulatory groups that are supposed to be watching out for the public good become so embedded and regarded as experts in their specialized fields that they walk in and out of the industries they're supposed to be regulating. It happens all the time in major industries that affect our modern world: banking, agriculture, health, energy, technology. Now, I would like to point out here that when I describe this group of elites in industry and finance and policy, I'm literally describing the Davos crowd, a group of wealthy, influential people who sit atop the giant corporations and influence peddling organizations of the world and decide how the future is going to be.
Those issues, as you very well know, and as the WEF has constantly advocated, are global issues that need to be dealt with on a cooperative manner.
Now is a historical moment, a time not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system.
Those same people then go to the UN and sit on the various committees and advisory panels, or they go to the think tanks and NGOs that work together with the WEF or the WHO or the IPCC. But without question, these people all live within an echo chamber that has long since stopped listening to what their intellectual inferiors think about how they should be able to conduct their own affairs under their own roofs in their own homes. That's you. That's me. We don't matter. Because we are not part of the club. We are not part of the club that has the most money, time, and influence at these organizations that are, as we speak, literally telling us how our lives are going to be.
The news is bleak. For the first time in its 15-year history, the top 5 places of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report were filled by environmental risks. So for the sake of people and the planet, turning this trajectory around is objectively the principal challenge of our age. Now, tragically, over 1 million people have been killed and every single economy battered by this pandemic. But if there's a silver lining to this appalling experience, it's an opportunity to use the urgent need and considerable funds for economic recovery to build back better, greener, and cleaner, to do things differently. Now, clearly that's not just another box to tick. It means making sustainability and resilience the lens through which we map out every decision in our recovery.
Pandemics cause change. Change is the constant, the only known. Everything else is an unknown variable. The only thing we can be certain of is that our reality after the pandemic will not be the same as it was before. Life will change in fundamental ways. We will feel it in every aspect of our lives. As we push our limits, we push Earth's as well. We must become smarter on how we grow, without dampening our impact. This would require unprecedented cooperation between individuals, enterprises, governments, and nations. Welcome to the World.
And so with that as the backstory, I want to talk about the one place where all those differences, all those different industries come together and agree. Vaccines are good. In fact, they're not just good, but vitally important. How do I know this? Because of Agenda 2030. All those people I just mentioned, the ones whose lives are totally unconcerned with hearing counter-arguments because they have become so focused on pushing for their solution that provides and paves provides for and paves the way to a better future as they envision it in both the business and societal spheres, all those people who have agreed to implement this plan agree with the vaccination cult. 14 of 17 SDGs for Agenda 2030 hinge on vaccines and figuring out how to get people to take them. They have spent endless resources on trying to figure out how to do this. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is telling us how important it is. It's their reason to exist.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. We know that there's a strong economic return on investments.
It seems like now they may have finally found their silver bullet. So everything that is being behaviorally programmed into our minds through constant reinforcement and messaging is about this one very thing, because without it, they can't create the new utopian world they have envisioned where needles give health and slavery to that ideology is akin to freedom. This is, of course, insane. I don't want to get into the detailed history of vaccines, but there is one element of that history I would like to shine the spotlight on, if you'll indulge me to try and make a point. Specifically, I would like to talk about measles. We are told, as I have been by my own family doctor, that measles is a dangerous disease. We are told that 1 in 1,000 can suffer serious side effects if they were to catch it. This is bullshit.
And I think it's fair to say that measles is possibly the equity virus.
Pandemics cause change.
Now is the historical moment.
There's something crazy going on.
It is the most insane period in my lifetime.
We know that there's a strong economic return on investments.
All the infectious diseases, whether it was scurvy or tuberculosis, for which there were no vaccines, along with peripheral fever and diphtheria and pertussis and measles, all disappeared at the same time without vaccination.
But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice.
It isn't true. But how then do people like our various health agencies and the WHO get away with scaring people by telling them it is a deadly disease and that we need to eradicate it with vaccination? How can they lie about the potential for negative outcomes or skew reality to fit their narrative? Some of you might already know where I'm going with this, but for the people who aren't old enough to remember when family sitcoms from just a few decades ago, measles was considered a pretty much benign disease.
Hi. Peter. What are you doing home from school?
They sent me home. Measles.
That's either measles or a strange case of red freckles.
You have got a temperature.
They told me 101.1. What's the record?
Never mind.
Oh, are you sure it's the measles?
Well, he certainly got all the symptoms. A slight temperature, a lot of dots, and a great big smile.
A great big smile.
No school for a few days.
Say hello to my dotted son for me. Tell him I'll bring him some comic books and I'll see you later, dear.
Okay, honey, bye.
Boy, this is the life, isn't it? Yeah. If you have to get sick, you sure can't beat the measles. That's right. No medicine.
Inside or out. Like shots, I mean.
Don't even mention shots. Yeah.
Because it was. When one kid would get sick with measles, just like with chickenpox, parents would invite kids over from the class or neighborhood to play so they could all be exposed long enough in enclosed settings and quarters to get the virus, and then they would all stay home for a week or two until it passed. No big deal. So then again, I ask you, how do you think they came up with these scary predictions of a danger for 1 in 1,000 kids? If you said they used the entire world to get that stat, you get a gold sticker. You see, it is a relatively benign disease, as long as you're relatively healthy when you get it. Is this sounding familiar at all to people? Like as in, this sounds like something else that's going on that sounds familiar, but I just can't put my finger on what it might be kind of vibe? Well, yeah, COVID, for a scary new disease, has a designation of COVID-19, as in Coronavirus ID 2019, as in there is one every year, and the only thing that has changed that seems to have made this one more deadly than any other is the panic and the fear and the confusion that was provoked by the CCP through a propaganda campaign in the early months of 2020. And then the fire of fear and confusion was stoked and pushed further by Billy Gates and the WHO, and then our own public health agencies. In case you live under a rock, Billy Gates' organization, Gavi, and the CCP out of China are the two largest funders of the WHO. So just to wrap up my comments about the measles and why we needed to fight the measles with a vaccine, let me ask you a question. Who suffers the most when a child gets measles? As in, historically, what happened when a child got the measles and had to stay home for 2 weeks? And this was, keep in mind, a long time before the concept of remote working was even conceivable as a thing. Who was really hurt when a child got measles? Keep in mind back then there was a thriving middle class with most people getting married younger, settling down earlier, having a house with a white picket fence, a couple kids, and a dog. But women who had historically been homemakers, as the men's incomes would up to that time be enough to afford all those pleasantries on one salary if you did things the right way, and you could still plan for kids' education, a cottage, and a comfortable retirement. But women had been entering the workforce between the 30s and the 70s in such a way that by 1970, 50% of single women and 40% of married women had entered the workforce. Now, without getting into the details around that, as I know we have all been told in recent years it's because the men oppressed the women and that's all you need to know, I bring it up just to point out one important thing. Who would watch the children when they had to stay home for 2 weeks? Well, the moms, that's who. And guess what? That was sort of a pain for the business owners who considered it their job to create the kind of workforce that would improve their bottom lines. In particular, very rich people saw the benefits from creating health care that made their employees able to show up for work without having to fight about whether or not they should have to pay them to stay at home with their sick kids. And when did the measles vaccine start coming out? In the early 70s. And why? It's no small part of the puzzle. The vaccine industry is built up with massive investment in the 40s and 50s to fight polio, around the same time that the WHO was establishing itself on the world stage. In the late 50s, the WHO made themselves a vital part of the effort to rid the world of smallpox. This, of course, required coordinated efforts among countries and pharmaceutical companies who just kept getting bigger and more powerful. An interesting excerpt from that period. WHO efforts came under criticism from some healthcare workers and human rights advocates. Some public health administrators charged that campaign workers at time bent WHO and local regulations. Some human rights advocates objected to the search and quarantine aspects of the program. Later, some critics claimed that physicians used coercion to ensure vaccination of quarantined individuals. That is from, you can go to the History of Vaccines timeline. It's got all that stuff there. There's a particular segment that is entitled 1967, WHO Pushes Eradication Efforts. Of course, sometimes we forget the lessons of the past, and even the players. WHO gets accused of misdeeds. I have to fix that part. I'll make a mental note here. That doesn't flow very well. The point is that we forget about stuff that happened in the past. We have been trained to have the kind of a memory of a fruit fly. And that stuff, the WHO has been accused of some pretty shady stuff in their past, but we forget about it. It doesn't matter, right? And so they just keep doing what they're doing. They press on, right? Because they care so much about everyone. Nobody cares about your family more than you do. Okay, now I'm going off script again. I just want to make this point. A giant corporation bent on controlling every aspect of lives, and I call it a corporation, but really it's a conglomeration of countries and NGOs and corporations and think tanks and academics. They all have come up with the same solution. It's called Agenda 2030, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. 14 of the 17. There's a graphic out there by Gavi, which I will include with this, where 14 of the 17 hinge on vaccination. I tried to make that point earlier. I think it didn't come out as well as I wanted it to, but 14 of 17. So their new utopia that they're creating within the next 10 years can only happen if mandatory vaccines happen. Okay, that's really, really important. Everyone's agreed to do this. So everyone is on board with the plan. Now, COVID is just giving a wonderful excuse to have everything that they wanted done. This is not that complicated. As for the pharmaceutical companies themselves, after the previous successes that established their necessity as public health agencies that can now save people from scary possibilities that magically always were more deadly around typically malnourished and impoverished populations and wartime, now they needed a new market to expand into and new product lines to push. And they had just created the combined MMR vaccine, licensed in 1971. This would be the grand push again, with assistance from the WHO. So the WHO really helped to make sure that not only were vaccines being used, they became like a worldwide priority because they saved so many lives, we're told. And if you can't see the way that business creates situations that it solves with its products, especially the medical business, then I don't know what to say to you. I just don't. You could blame that on capitalism, but if somebody's selling you a beauty product, and you think it makes you feel better about yourself, there is some utility in that. But if someone's selling you a health product, and they just, like, any negative consequences are just like, they become, you can't talk about negative things that are associated with vaccines, because then there's something wrong with you. Do you see the problem with creating a scenario like that and then creating a giant World Health Organization who makes it their mission to vaccinate every single person on the planet? Does anybody see a problem with that? Anybody? No? Okay. So where was I? So the WHO is helping to. They helped to create the entire vaccine industry, really. I mean, the WHO helped to legitimize and make vaccines it's the single greatest thing that's ever happened to humanity. And if they didn't believe it, then why would 14 of 17 be directly connected to that? You tell me. The rest, as they say, is history, but it was a history full of money and influence, and particularly in the developed world, putting the needs and interests of business at the forefront on two specific levels. One, increase profits and sales, and two, by making all the gains from getting rid of deadly diseases that were in fact just more sick days for employees and their children go away, so that everyone can make more money, especially the ownership class. It's funny, but I distinctly remember something that was said to me and my wife when she was pregnant with our firstborn. And I went out and bought a handful of books to do some reading and see if I couldn't come up with my own opinion on what I thought about going with the schedule that was proposed and being mercilessly pushed through every medium, including our family doctor. But a friend of ours told us the reason for her getting her girls vaccinated was that she didn't want to have to risk the time off work if one of them got sick. And somebody said that to me, and I was just like, I was reading these books, what? And there it was. I was literally floored about the callousness of her attitude. Here, I had been reading about how all these vaccines were being introduced to protect kids against relatively benign diseases, with the reason being sold to parents that there might be awful consequences if they were to catch these diseases organically, and it was a total lie. The fact was that they wanted the profits and the workforce at work. They were willing to lie and scare people for that end. And all the potential negative outcomes were always at best downplayed and concealed, and at worst, straight up lied about. If the intervention causes more harm than the disease itself, but they lie to skew the statistics in their favor and make a false reality, which they then spoon feed to people whose job it is to protect their patients, why on earth would they not be doing this right now? If we can hope that anything good comes of this, it will be that right now, this is getting the spotlight. And you can count on the agencies and influences I mentioned above making it their priority to distract and deflect from reality, to push what they wanted before all this new normal and post-COVID world talk being pumped out by the WEF since March started. In fact, this has been the agenda all along. All they needed was the excuse to put free people into bondage. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy to suggest that plans have been laid out, in some cases for decades, with the express purpose of molding public opinion based on a presupposition that what they are doing is all based on their impenetrable, unassailable truth. Vaccines have saved countless lives. This is at best an exaggeration based on believing the very same tobacco science PR teams that tried to fool the general public back in the last half of the 20th century, and at worst a total fabrication of reality. To hell with the consequences. So what I'm saying is, it's at best an exaggeration of the truth by, like I said, just constantly saying safe and effective, safe and effective. It saved countless millions, and all these people have been saved by vaccines. And if you don't get the vaccine, 1 in 1,000 children's going to suffer severe side effects from measles. That's, I mean, like, it's not true. It's not true. It's not true. I don't know what else to tell you. It's not true. You have to be really unhealthy and have some serious deficiencies, probably in vitamin D and C. It tends to be that those things are very, very important and cheap for keeping people healthy, and exercise and all the good things that you need. Healthy attitudes, joy. Preferably you don't freeze at night and you can keep yourself warm. And if it's too hot, you can cool off. These are all things that help to regulate human health more than a needle. Sorry, it's true. It's true. It's true. How do you not know it's true? Like, I didn't do polio, but there's a whole nother story with polio. And it really did kickstart the beginnings of the vaccine industry's influence in the world. And, you know, there's a lot of questionable things that they did around keeping records and how they altered some of the, like, it was the original COVID, okay? Look, polio was bad. I know a guy that was put into an iron lung, or I know a guy that was paralyzed. I know kids that got brain damage from lead poisoning. I mean, like, that stuff happens, but you can't stop lead poisoning with a needle. You can't stop air pollution with a needle. So all the things that big industries do to pollute our environment, and then sell us a cure through the end of a syringe, it's all just about business. It is. These externalities, right? Things that happen to people. They get poisoned, whether it's environmental. Back then, they had DDT, lots of it, DDT, to cause the same kind of effects that polio did magically. They were bathing kids in DDT. So look, it's not as clear cut as most people put it. Again, I would go say read Suzanne Humphrey's book, Dissolving Illusions. She goes into the historical record and documents a lot of what they did, and it's a fantastic book. Just read it. Okay. So it's an exaggeration, and to hell with the consequences. So they exaggerate the benefits of vaccination, say that it saved millions of lives. They give the reasoning to build up these businesses, and the WHO gets bigger and bigger with more influence. And now COVID, boom, we take over the world, and it's because the vaccine's going to save you. And to hell with the consequences. Does that sound familiar at all? Does that sound familiar at all? This type of thinking is at the very heart of the devil-may-care attitude that has pervaded big business interests and the worst side of capitalism since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The idea being that we make the money first and only extol the virtues of that venture while downplaying the risks and externalities that may have been caused in your wake. That is the bad side of industrial capitalism. And it is the one we are usually told is the one we want to leave behind. So why then do people think that the opposite is true in the misappropriation of science at the behest of big business, and that it somehow becomes virtuous only when it comes to the production of vaccines? We know for a fact that that mostly the very same players, agencies, and pharmaceutical companies who make said vaccines also produce pills and medicine in other areas, a handful of which are actually helpful, and most of the rest are always associated with higher incidences of long-term negative health outcomes, addiction, and death. And we are now trusting these people with our very futures over a disease that kills almost no healthy people. For people under 70, you're more likely to die in a car accident than from COVID-19. But all the dangers and pitfalls that we know are associated with poverty and despair and the violence that typically accompanies those conditions do not choose the weakest among us. They can strike seemingly indiscriminately. And so now the greatest social justice cause of all, human freedom, hangs in the balance because of what a bunch of the richest, most powerful people in the world are telling us we need to do. The fight against this corrupt application of public health priorities is the very essence of a true social justice campaign. These people exemplify the worst kind of corruption that money can buy. It's time to tell those people they do not own us. We are not their property. We are free. Took me a couple days to write that. Well, I should say probably 3 or 4 hours. And I had a bunch of stuff. I had a lot of. I'm gonna put that up. There's a bunch of the sources from some of the stuff that I took out of the clips. I'm gonna put it up. And the Gavi graphic, they were discussing at a soiree put on last year by Gavi, where all the governments and pharmaceutical reps all sent their people to a big powwow where they discussed how to convince people to take vaccines because it's just so important. What's wrong with those people? They don't know that vaccines are good. They're obviously good. We don't even need to talk about that part of the thing. But let's talk about how we convince people to take them. Look, 14 of the 17 SDGs require vaccination. That was last year. That was like November. I'll find the link for that too and I'll put it under here. But yeah. I don't have the best setup here. I'm trying to make this as palatable as possible. I know it's going to have my big ugly face in the middle, so that's what I had to work with. But, you know, I'm coming up on an hour here, and I'm just going to put this out because, look, here's what I want. I want a discussion. I want to talk to the people that are doing what they're doing right now, who might be doing it because they think that they're helping people. And, you know, it has to do with groupthink as well. You get into a room full of people and they're all doing something and talk about something and acting in such a way that it seems normalized. Like it seems okay to just screw everybody in the free world over, destroy their jobs, destroy their livelihoods, and have a plan to take care of them based on taking all the existing corporations and the stakeholder capitalist companies that have agreed to this plan. And there's like, I mean, I've posted that stuff before too. There are some of the biggest corporations and banks in the world are all taking this as an opportunity that we just can't miss to take all this stuff about the Green New Deal and Agenda 2030 and sustainable, and put it into a tight little package and say, this is how we're going to move forward. We're going to create these green jobs. We're going to create the zero carbon world moving forward because carbon dioxide is bad. And I mean, we can have that argument. This book, if you can see over here, False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg, I've pointed it out before. It's a fantastic book. He points out that there's a lot of alarmism that surrounds climate science. And that alarmism was used as the impetus for creating the global 2030 agenda. Right? They were talking about, biodiversity loss and the 6th great extinction and all the kind of stuff that you might hear coming out of Extinction Rebellion. But generally speaking, on the left side of the spectrum. And the left side of the spectrum has devoured everything else in the world in the last decade. Through no small part because of critical theory and all the kind of stuff that James Lindsay, go look him up on YouTube, look up his most recent stuff. He talks about this way that these people have had their minds sort of, and their priorities geared towards this social justice activism. And social justice activism involves a number of things, but really what it involves is taking the people we were and steering us to be the people they think we could be if they just get all of their machinations in place. And they're doing it. They're doing it right now. And, you know, again, I don't know. Is it a bad thing? I guess it remains to be seen. But it's not dissimilar from other communist revolutions. The only thing that is different is the fact that once they have this stuff out there, it's going to be impossible to opt out. It's all being laid right now. And I've spoken to friends about it who I think are sensible, and they see all this stuff, and they can't see it going as far as I'm suggesting it's going. And I'm saying, if they have the banks, and they have the health agencies, and they have the governments all on board, and they have the academics, I don't see how it can go any other way. I mean, we're looking at a pretty violent revolution in the United States when they try to destroy people's livelihoods and take away their guns and tell them they can't eat meat. And this is all part of it. You can't eat meat, you can't have guns, you can't own land, private property will be a thing of the past. But it's all being done through blockchain so we can track everything, and the world is going to move forward. The question is, do the people that are now assuming the reins and the control over the formerly free world, do they have your best interests at heart? Have they even remotely thought this through? Certainly they have. They thought it through to such an extent that they have decided climate change is the biggest threat, existential threat to the world. Vaccines are good. We can solve both of those things with a giant world infrastructure administered through the UN and the WEF and their global strategic partners, who are some of the biggest corporations in the world that have all been going in this kind of leftist ideology, brainwashing with their employees for years. And anybody that says there might be something wrong with that is dismissed as a racist or a sexist or anti-science or climate denier. I mean, like, it could not be more obvious that these people have stopped listening to what regular people are saying. They don't care anymore what regular people think, because regular people are too foolish to control their own lives. And, you know, maybe if people didn't act that way, it would be true. But people do act that way. People are foolish. People are insensitive. They are thoughtless with some of the things they do. And the only kind of stuff that improves that situation is education. And unfortunately, not everybody is the type of person where they want to necessarily... That's the other thing about it, is that education, when they talk about education, they don't mean teaching you to think. They mean indoctrination. They mean, we're going to tell you how the world should be, and you're going to operate within those parameters. And that's what's happening. We're going to shut down conspicuous consumption. We're going to stop giving people the ability to do things that they think they should do. It's all going to be regulated by a supranational regulatory structure, universal basic income. And I go back to the comments about the psychopathic corporation, because I think that it really frames it well. Psychopaths are typically intelligent, personable, and disinhibited, and have an alluring aura of confidence. Yet they also lack feelings of empathy, guilt, and remorse. That seemingly minor emotional quirk has had a dramatic effect on the way they behave, often leading to antisocial behavior. However, psychopaths are not incapable of moral reasoning. Multiple studies have found that they are particularly adept at certain types of moral thinking, particularly those that balance the consequences of actions. So where non-psychopaths might experience revulsion at intentionally killing one person to save the lives of several others, psychopaths are far more likely to dispassionately favor the needs of the many over the needs of the few. They make good utilitarians. And I'm trying to stay away from anything that is not like perfectly obvious. Like big business always puts its best foot forward or its best face forward and tries to ignore the bad stuff, right? You can't make better people by mandating that they be better people in the same way that you can't make people healthier by mandating vaccines. This is absurd. But it works for the many over the concerns of the few. And that's where we're at, I think. I just want to have the conversation. Because like I said at the beginning of this, I think I said it, I don't have a job anymore. And so I have to decide where I'm going to go moving forward. And so I've been discussing with some people that I met at a protest whether or not I could be a part of their group. And I got to tell you, man, this is where we're at as a society. I agree that people, when they're not engaged in thinking, actively thinking in their lives about things that are bigger than them, when they're not actively engaged in that endeavor, they can become a danger to people around them. I think that people should be responsible. I think that they should try to do whatever they can to make the world a better place through their actions. And I have tried to do that. I have tried to be that person. I have tried to tell people what was going on. I've been fired for it. I have tried to tell people that what's happening is our world is being upended to be replaced with this new world, which reeks a lot of communist stuff. And I'm not just saying that. Like there's a beautiful book called The Red Flag. I highly suggest everyone reads it. It's by one of the most foremost scholars on communism, I think from Oxford. And he wrote this book. And he talked about the history of it in several different countries and areas. And, the rhetoric is always the same. Psychopaths, when they get in trouble, and I'm not saying everyone's a psychopath, but what I'm saying is the way that people fit into these corporate structures, it's a level of separation from real people. It's a level of separation from reality. And these people have decided that capitalism is the problem. Now, I know that I'm saying that there's an issue here with the power dynamic where governments working hand in hand with corporations, giant corporations that don't necessarily tell the truth about stuff, and neither do governments for that matter. I mean, governments are the #1 killer of people in the history of the world, by the way. I think we're going to keep going in that fashion. But the question becomes, how do you make better people? Which is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think that you can't mandate better people. I think that people, they either choose to look at life through the lens of, I have an opportunity here to do something with my life and make my life better, and I have to engage in it, and I want to engage with people around me that also want to engage in making their lives better in that same sort of way. And it's an attitude thing. And the problem with trying to enforce an attitude on the rest of the world is that people don't want to be told what to do, #1. They don't want forced vaccinations, #2. Especially people that don't like to be told what to do. Especially the people that like to think for themselves. And right now, this is a global coup of people who think that everyone else who doesn't agree with them is a problem, and so they need to be put into check. This is totally authoritarian, it's totalitarian, technocratic elite control of the entire world. It's obvious. And you might say that it's not that different from where we were. Well, then I might say that you do not know what freedom is, or was, or what capitalism is, or the ability to choose how you either put your money in. But I'm terrible with money. I've been trying to get better. I'm terrible with impulse control. I've been trying to get better. But nobody's going to mandate that on me. You can't mandate that on me. And I suppose that means that I'm one of the people that's going to go to a re-education camp or whatever after I get my vaccines forced on me. That might or might not do some damage to me. That would not have happened if it was not mandated, which is why it has never been mandated in the United States. You have a right to personal autonomy, and they're taking away that right. So what rights are you going to have if you don't agree with the power structure that is currently being implemented? None. None. There will be no ability to opt out. But they know what's good for you, so you better listen and just do as you're told. You don't want to cause trouble for yourself. It's not that dissimilar from life as it was. But I don't think that they're properly... I think that they've drunk their own Kool-Aid at this point. And the world that we're leaving was one where at least people could be happy to know that they weren't constantly under the boot of surveillance. We could pretend that our lives were still somewhat free of influence and surveillance. But they weren't. They were constantly getting more and more tamped down, which that's just another excuse these people use to say that, oh, it's going to happen anyways, so it's inevitably. But I honestly think that, people can be better people if you just reach out to them and have conversations with them, like real conversations, like not mandating stuff and telling them how their life's going to be and telling them that they're going to be an issue if they don't agree with what has to happen. And it's just it's inherently twisted. I don't know how people don't see that. So as messy as that was, I'm probably just going to upload this. I've been trying to mess with some software to make a channel. I'm really not that adept at this stuff. I've been asking for help, but we're all alone in this new normal, I guess. We're all alone until we're not. But just for the record, I love you all, and I'm ready to talk when you are. So yeah.